Good morning, everyone. I am Teresa Welsh, a reporter with DevX. Thank you so much for joining us today for this FragilityForum 2020 virtual series. This week, we're examining issues related to refugees and migration as we mark the celebration of World Refugee Day on Saturday. We're here today with our global group of distinguished panelists to discuss how the World Bank and other development actors can support refugee inclusion in COVID-19 responses and help to mitigate the health and economic impacts of the pandemic on refugee populations. We'll also aim to inform the World Bank's refugee policy review framework, currently being developed for the IDA-19 window for host communities and refugees. We welcome your engagement during this session on social media. And if you'd like to ask a question of our panelists during the session, there's two ways for you to do that. You can do that using the hashtag FragilityForum2020 on Twitter, or you can use the dialog box that you'll see to the right of the video feed as you're watching on World Bank Live. Then I'd love to introduce our participants that are joining us from all over the globe today for this lively conversation. Franck Bousquet is the Senior Director of the Fragility Conflict and Violence Team at the World Bank Group. Ewen MacLeod is Advisor to the High Commissioner for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We're also joined by the Honorable Hilary Onek, Minister for Relief, Disaster Preparedness and Refugees from the Government of Uganda, as well as JB Sumbwewo, Deputy Director of Programs in Kenya for the International Rescue Committee. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, for tuning in today, and thank you so much to our panel for being here to chat about this very timely topic. So Franck, I'd love to start with you to learn a little bit more about what the World Bank is up to in this realm. So under IDA-19, the World Bank has committed to develop a refugee policy assessment framework. What was the reason behind creating this tool, and what do you envision it looking like? As well as what barriers do you think you'll have to overcome in developing the framework?
Good morning, Teresa. Thank you, and very happy to be here with you today. Very happy to be actually with also high-level representative of key partners. Uganda, big time, hosting countries, UNHCR, with whom we have an excellent partnership, and ICR, who is really a fantastic voice with its president on this issue of refugee. So let me just say a few words first for the audience before being too technical and talking about IDA window and a lot of jargon about why we're focusing on refugees and what has changed over the past few years. 2 points. Today, we know from UNHCR statistics that about 26 million refugees, 80% are actually living in developing countries. And 3/4 of them, 75%, are still displaced after 5 years. So the two key takeaways. One, we should be really thankful and acknowledging the huge efforts that developing countries are actually doing in hosting refugees. And I think that's important. So it's so good to have some countries hosting refugees in this dialogue. Secondly, it's not only a humanitarian issue, it's a development issue. And that's why the partnership with, for instance, UNHCR is so important. When you look at the type of crises that we are facing today, which are really protracted crises, with once again 3/4 of refugees that are still present in hosting countries after 5 years, this means that you need to provide the complementarity needed vis-à-vis the humanitarian assistance. So for us, for the bank, we are focusing on eradication of poverty and boosting shared prosperity, and therefore we need to focus, following our strategy that we released recently, dealing with fragility, conflict, and violence, on the mitigation of and the spillover of the conflict and across the world. And over the past few years, Teresa, just to respond to your questions before turning into these tools, we have realized that we provided quite a bit of support to all those countries. We have, over the past few years, IDA, which is the International Development Aid, which is really the fund for the poorest countries, has provided about $1.5 billion supporting more than 30 operations in 14 low-income countries that host refugees. This is quite significant. Moving forward, we will actually provide an additional under IDA-19 that you mentioned, which is really a fund for the poorest. Starting July 1st, we are going to provide $2.2 billion over 3 years periods to support hosting communities and refugees. So really, this agenda for us is important. Again, it's not only a humanitarian issue, it's a development issue. And we do not support just refugee, we support refugee and hosting communities, given what I just mentioned. And we have realized over the past few years, we, meaning the international community, obviously, that, yes, providing support through investment projects in health, in education, in terms of job, economic opportunity, this is critical. But what is also very important is the policy angle. Let me give you some example. If I take the example of Ethiopia, for instance, Ethiopia is a good example because it's actually Africa's second largest hosting countries. It hosts about 700,000 refugees, a little bit more, that are coming from Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And the bank has been really working closely with the government, providing support, significant support. For instance, we provided a $200 million program to support economic opportunities for refugee and hosting communities. And what is very important is to see the progress made by the country. Ethiopia passed a refugee policy, refugee proclamation in 2019 that is really giving the opportunity for refugees to live outside camp and to work in the formal sector. So very important. I could give other example where you see this link between projects and policies. In Colombia, for instance, we are supporting Colombia through another vehicle, which is the Global Concessional Financing Facility, Colombia being impacted by the Venezuelan crisis and hosting for more than 1.8 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And again, we have been supporting the country, and the country has also progressively regularized the legal status of many Venezuelans, enabling them to enter the labor market and access education and health service. So you can see this link between providing support, financing support on investment, but also policies which are really critical. In that context, within IDA-19, which is again the fund for the poorest countries that will be triggered starting July 1st, we are going to conduct a systematic review of refugee policy and institutional environment in those countries. And in order to carry out those reviews, we are currently developing what we call refugee policy review framework, which will allow to articulate the key policy area that will be included in this review. For instance, focusing on economic opportunities, on access to national systems, on regulatory environment and governance. So this is quite important. We are just starting it. We are consulting, of course, refugee hosting countries, donor countries, UNHCR, our key partners in this process, civil society organizations, including IRC as well. And really this framework, just to finish, is meant to inform dialogue. And meant to inform dialogue around what? Well, around the policy that can help advance the socio-economic development of refugee and host communities, given what I just mentioned before. Providing financing and support to projects, this is essential. Otherwise, you talk a lot, but there's nothing happening on the ground. But at the same time, it's very important to try to see how we can help those countries that are really leading the dialogue and hosting refugees. So this is supposed to be done over the coming months. Obviously, there are some challenges. Teresa, you were asking me what are some of the challenges. The first one is that we need to look between laws and implementation. It's easy to pass a law in some cases, not always, but it's very difficult to actually have it implemented. And therefore, the measurement that implementation is happening will be something we need to focus. Second point is that every country context matters. And therefore, we need to understand the specific circumstance of different countries and not take specific policies out of the context. And that's something which is, of course, difficult, finding the balance and treating all the countries equally under the methodology. The last point I would like to mention, I will stop here, is that obviously this framework is not an index. It's not at all about comparing and judging or ranking refugee hosting communities, but instead it's again to support countries that are really carrying the biggest burden. Let's not forget, 82% of refugees are being hosted in developing countries, and supporting them through project investment, but also through policies that are so important for hosting communities and also for refugees. I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Franck, for that great frame for our discussion and more information about what the World Bank is up to in this realm. Ewen, Franck was talking a lot about ways to ensure that refugees have self-reliance and are integrated into communities. And so the Global Compact on Refugees codified a number of commitments to support refugees in this realm. And we know that this requires enabling policies, right? Like freedom of movement, right to work, access to education, that many host countries have historically been rather reluctant to adopt. How is UNHCR changing to help host governments adopt and implement policies like this that can translate the compact into concrete change on the ground for refugee communities?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to offer a few words on this timely topic. It's a great pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Teresa, you mentioned the Global Compact. I think there are two really critical components of the Global Compact that we need to bear in mind with respect to its objectives. And overall, the goal was a greater shared responsibility globally. And so I think this is turning on two critical reflections. One, how do we forge a global partnership on this challenge? And how do we design and deliver a program of inclusion? Now, last December, we had the first meeting of the Global Refugee Forum, which I think was a very concrete expression of partnership, brought together public, private, civil society, NGOs in a very significant effort to get to grips and discuss and agree upon a set of commitments and pledges, which we are now following through on. Inclusion, if I may say a word on that, this is not such a straightforward notion as it might appear. I think there are three really critical dimensions to it. It requires, to be successful, contributions from donors and donor countries to include refugees and host communities in their own programming. It requires hosting states to factor in the presence of refugees and host communities into their own national planning and programming processes. And it requires an inclusive approach both of refugees and local communities if it's going to be successful. Now, we also know that at the beginning of refugee emergencies, financing and resources are mobilized relatively successfully at the beginning. But as Franck very rightly highlighted, most refugee situations are protracted, almost 80% around the world, and very heavily falling on developing countries. And it's in that protracted phase that we need to consolidate and sustain engagement. And that's why we believe that working through country and local systems offers not only efficiency gains, but also the greatest possibility of sustaining what is required throughout the displacement cycle. And in our experience over the years, we've seen a number of excellent instances, and it's no accident that Uganda is represented very well on this panel. And it would be somewhat arrogant of me to say anything about Ugandan refugee policy, since it's been going on for almost 60 years and has set an exemplary tradition for many other states to follow. And I'm happy to give examples. I mean, we can look at, see what Jordan has done, what Turkey has done, what Colombia more recently has done, but also less well-known examples in Niger and Cameroon of donors, governments, and international and local actors supporting local systems. And we believe that this really does offer the best opportunity to sustain the kind of engagement that we need. These are very complex challenges. They're not straightforward. And overcoming what we call protection deficits or reducing the kinds of vulnerabilities that refugees and other marginalized populations suffer, and at the same time reducing poverty and improving social and development outcomes. These are multi-generational challenges. They're not achieved overnight. And so by working collectively together, not just UNHCR very clearly, because if we are going to make success, it requires a collective outcome.
Oops, I think we're having some technical difficulties. Ewen, are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Great. Hi, Minister. Thank you so much
Hi.
for joining us.
Thank you very much, Teresa.
We're so happy to have you here with us today. A couple of our other presenters have mentioned Uganda, so we're so pleased to have you here to share your experience with us. And Uganda's been a clear leader in adopting, some of the progressive policies that both Ewen and Franck were talking about that ensure refugees can move freely and have access to healthcare and education and work. So could you share with us some lessons that other countries can learn from your experiences in maintaining political support for these policies, which we know can be really tough when you're looking at, refugee populations that may be there for generations, and, host communities can have a hard time with that?
Thank you very much, Teresa. I really do appreciate being in this forum and sharing our views and experiences. Uganda is a host to over 1.4 million refugees. We have open door policies mainly due to our humane character. We sympathize and look at their problems as global problems, as our problems. We have a progressive approach. We are maintaining refugees in 14 districts of our country. Most of them are in the northern part of our country, which previously also had long history of insurgency. So really, but the population there are kind and they receive the refugees and give them all the opportunities. We settle them in order to enable them to live a normal life in land. We give them land to settle, to live a normal life. We have fully adopted the CRRF, Comprehensive Refugee Framework Policy. We have adopted it fully, and we are implementing this in the sector, in the areas of education, in the areas of health, water and environment, jobs, livelihoods. We are implementing those programs. Our target is to make the refugee as resilient and self-supporting as possible, and they become productive. So we have maintained refugees in our economic policies of inclusion, and we see that we enable them to become resilient and self-reliant, development, and become development-oriented by initially giving them sufficient education and exposure and training and enabling environment to make them develop their own skills and talents and their humanity and be on their own. Of course, we also offer them some psychosocial support training, because most of them come from their countries with a lot of trauma in their heads when they've seen killings and the destruction of life and property, and they're still living that. So we make sure we work on it to make sure they forget it when they're in Uganda and start to live and realize that there's another option of life to mankind. You can live differently from that violent past. We have included refugees in our service development when we are developing services like roads, like health facilities, education facilities. Refugees are central. We include them together with our host community. We also encourage for peaceful coexistence between the refugee and the host communities by kind of amalgamating certain activities so that both can participate and develop friendship. We also encourage and ensure that they are in service delivery. They can, whatever produce that they can sell whatever they produce. Our intention for refugees, as I mentioned earlier, is to make them resilient and be able to survive in an economic environment, in any economic environment. We are currently trying to activate the private sector in our country to also get involved and to enable the refugees to work and also partner with the refugees. As you know, our policy has open door and is free. The refugees are free to move around the country. As long as you are registered, you are a genuine refugee, you are registered, you are free to get jobs, you are free to move anywhere in the country, you are free to participate in any social activity except for politics. You are free to participate and be part of the society. In that vein, I want to thank the World Bank. On behalf of our government, we most sincerely thank the World Bank for the initiative they brought forward, introducing, first of all, they supported us with a soft loan of $50 million, which we effectively used to develop infrastructure like schools, health facilities, and so on for community, our host community and the refugees. They share those facilities and they live like brothers and sisters. We want to thank them further for giving additional $150 million as grant to cover the development response to displacement impact. That is Dr. Deep project, which we have introduced here. As I mentioned earlier, we have adapted fully the CRF mode of planning for refugees, where together with the donors in our country, we sit together and we bring forward positive plans in areas to improve access to basic social services, to enhance environmental management, because the refugees, the only source of energy they have for cooking is firewood, and that destroys our forests and environment. So we are trying to work on that by making them again replant the forest. Sometimes we give them money to do that. They are paid to do that, to replant forests back, to also improve on the cooking stoves, which uses less fuel, etc., etc. Currently, our energy ministry is also putting in place electricity distribution. They're laying power lines in the refugee settlement so that the refugee can benefit from this alternative clean energy. So really, the World Bank has done very well with us. The $50 million initially soft loan, the $150 million grant, which is we are going to utilize further to strengthen the position of refugees, promote jobs, livelihoods, and we have also additional support from countries like Netherlands and European Union and Denmark, which have come with initiatives also to support our policy on refugees. We are doing well, and the refugees, we want to maximize and really develop them so that when they go back to their country, they will be able to develop their country and also ensure peaceful coexistence in their country like they are existing now in Uganda. Thank you very much. I see that the things seem to have gone off. The line seems to have gone off, but I do greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So we are missing our moderator. We have to auto-moderate ourselves. I think there's...
Now you have come online, Frank. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Minister, for your leadership again. I guess
Were you able to listen to what I was saying without the moderator?
It was perfect. You were saying loud and clear, and your leadership on this issue of your government and yourself was very clear. So we are just waiting for Teresa to come back. I think she's facing some IT issue.
Yeah. Well, you can moderate as well. As we are waiting for Teresa, you can moderate.
I can do that. I was actually curious to hear about how did you respond to COVID-19, because that's really the elephant in the room. And, and COVID-19 has shown us that refugee inclusion is more important than ever. And you said it. So that maybe could be interesting actually for our audience. But Teresa is back. So Teresa, we are happy to have you.
So sorry about that, everyone. I, like everyone else, am dealing with the growing pains of working from home, and my internet went out. Many apologies to everyone. I'm so sorry about that. And apologies, Minister, for missing the tail end of your remarks there. But thank you so much for sharing your experience from Uganda. We obviously have, so much to learn from what you've done. And, unfortunately, not all refugee hosting countries have been able to take the measures that you've taken and, to really ensure that you've got host communities on board and refugees are integrating in such a way. I'd love to move next to chat a little bit with JB about the view from Kenya. And so, JB, I'm interested in learning what your expectations are for the World Bank's new refugee policy review framework, particularly if financing gets approved for Kenya in this new IDA window for host countries and refugees.
Do I have a minute for the COVID report on refugees? COVID report on refugees.
Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
Yeah, our government has had a shutdown briefly, and now it's easing out. At the moment, in the country, we have got 700 and about 760 COVID cases which were tested. Out of the 700 and about 60 cases, over 600 have healed and have been discharged. They have been discharged, and we have at the moment about 120 in hospital. No death so far, and very few refugees have had the case. We have less than 40 refugees that are infected by the virus, and they are all being treated. They will all be all right. So that is our position with COVID-19. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. Finish.
Thank you so much for that update, Minister. JB, as we move to you, maybe if you want to give us a bit of a look at the COVID response from the view in Kenya as well as your thoughts about the World Bank's refugee policy review.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I hope you can hear me. Please confirm you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you great.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, and greetings from Nairobi, and thank you for this opportunity to this short presentation. So for what really are our expectations of the World Bank's new refugee policy, if we do get financing in Kenya, really I think it's a game changer. It would definitely have very positive impact. I think it would support the refugee policy here in Kenya, and the refugees themselves would be viewed by the government not so much as a burdensome population, but that's only the responsibility of UNHCR and NGOs, but that the government would actually take responsibility for the refugees. I think it would also be a huge catalyst for self-reliance for the refugees. And it would even allow, for instance, the private sector to come in to support the government with the refugees. I think there would be more meaningful inclusion of refugees, both in the national and in the county plans, both technical and financial support. I think this is something that would really allow inclusion of refugees, especially in the counties that host refugees. We would see a lot of projects opening up for both refugees and host communities, because this is something we really insist on. Remember that Kenya has been hosting refugees for the last years. Currently we have over 500,000. We have second to third generation even residing in the country right now. And so I think that this idea window would really take us to the next level that we've been pushing for as ING support also of UNHCR, and we would see refugees actually taking control of their lives. I think one of the things that we felt has been missing for refugees is the lack of financial inclusion, the lack of freedom of movement, and safety nets, the lack of safety nets. And there's been a lot of confusion as far as how the government handles refugees, especially on issues around work permits. And we hope that these are areas that will be touched on by financing from IDA window. So I think, yeah.
And do you want to give us a bit about the COVID situation as well in Kenya and how that's impacting your operations?
Well, I think, okay. And for now, we are getting, refugees are getting tested like everybody else in the country. But of course, that's just as far as it goes, Maybe I think in a positive way, the fact that refugees reside in camps, which is a little bit remote from Nairobi, which is one of the hotspots in the country, we haven't actually seen a large number of refugees, very, very minimal numbers affecting refugees. But now I think definitely they are included in the response, because the national government is taking charge of responding, hospitalization and testing of suspected cases for COVID-19. But I think that's the beginning and the end of it. The major area of concern is really financing for the impact of COVID-19. We are hearing a lot of support coming, safety nets actually being provided to local Kenyans. But for refugees, this is not really something that's coming out clear. And so I think this is really a priority for us, is that we would get refugees considered actually in the multi-purpose cash transfers, for example, that's already started off with the Kenyan government. But because they are, they're not actually considered within the national plans and the county plans. Right now, we are not seeing any particular support going to the refugees for the COVID-19 response. So the other one is they are, of course, omitted when you're talking about financial inclusion, like where the refugees would need some kind of support for, like soft loans or loans being provided to small businesses, local businesses. The refugees are not included into this. And this is really tied very much to other underlying fundamental issues. Like I just mentioned, that we have issues around financial inclusion. So because of the way refugees are registered in the country, it means that many of them actually can't have bank accounts, because the alien card keeps changing. It has a time limit, so you may have it for 2 years or 3 years. When that time elapses, your identification changes. So with the bank, you can't keep doing that for the bank. You can't also keep doing that for the SIM card, the telephone SIM card, which is like an identity and a bank account for Kenyans, really. So that means then when funding is allowed, when funding is available, whether through the government or in the private sector, the refugees are not able to tap into this because the identity limits them. The identification really limits them to actually accessing these opportunities. So I think really with the IDA window, this would actually change. And so for the short term, our biggest need and concern for the refugee is the safety nets. Just having the living, and those who are most critical are really missing out at the moment for any support that's out there. Back to you, Teresa.
Great, thank you so much, JP, for that view from Kenya. Ewen, I'd love to hear from the UNHCR perspective, you know, how the organization is approaching the COVID-19 response, you know, with sort of this refugee inclusion frame in mind, and, you know, what challenges that poses for your organization when you're looking at your activities globally, as well as, you know, as we prepare for a worldwide economic downturn, how that could possibly impact refugees particularly.
Thank you. I mean, like every other organization and government and stakeholder around the world, I think we're all adjusting to what will be a very changed operational environment in future, and I suspect for quite a number of years to come. And as we're all, I think, acutely aware, none of us really have a solid idea exactly of how deep and how wide the impact of all of this is going to be. So our response I would characterize as twofold. Firstly, evidently the public advocacy on inclusion will and should continue, and I'm very happy to share how satisfied we've been, in particular in the response of the international financial institutions, the IMF, and particularly the World Bank, for their very, very rapid response to this, and for their strong commitment also to including marginalized populations, including refugees. And not only the strength of that initial response to the public health emergency, but also very early on recognizing what the economic consequences will be, particularly for many poor populations around the world who are dependent on the informal sector for simply earning enough money to get through the day. And this will be critically important in future. Secondly, as you would expect from a large operational agency with a very extensive deep field presence, and what we've done is focused immediately on those very high risk and acute vulnerabilities that we see in locations like refugee camps. And of course, the one that springs immediately to mind is Bangladesh. Or with the other large refugee situation, the Syrian one in the Middle East, where families are extremely hard pressed to meet their daily needs as a consequence of the economic impact. So typically, we're spending a lot of effort to try and reinforce health, hygiene, sanitation, infrastructure in those hard to reach places, and redoubling our efforts, as your colleague from Kenya intimated, to see how we can enlarge, widen, deepen the delivery of cash transfers to households. Clearly, this is a very efficient means of addressing the immediate consequences for very poor households. But we can't emphasize enough that what we have at the moment is inadequate to the tasks, and we are clearly going to have to build a stronger coalition and a collective effort to meet the challenge, both tomorrow and here on in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ewen, for that rather sobering summary of, you know, what we are all facing as we sort of start to think through what the implications really are for the global economy and the most vulnerable populations. Franck, I'd love to come to you from your view of this sitting at the bank, and you know, how you envision the bank working with other partners, UNHCR, and other organizations within the international system on the COVID response, particularly as it pertains to refugees.
So, I mean, we have already started to work on it. And I have to say that the focus on refugees, but also IDPs, who are very vulnerable to outbreaks of communicable disease, is especially important. I mean, we need to make it very clear for the audience that they are being impacted, those refugees, not only on the health front, it's very clear, because very often they are excluded from the national health systems. They are being impacted in terms of the economic impact, which is quite significant for them. And last but not least, they're also being impacted in terms of protection. And you can see. So on our end, there are three things that we are doing. First, we are supporting countries, and as you may have seen, we really have delivered in more than 100 countries support to deal with the emergency. And that's very important. At the end of the day, we have to realize that the protection and well-being of refugees depends on the support to those countries and hosting countries. And that's the first point. Second point, our emergency response programs in several host countries, and I would say, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Chad, Lebanon, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, have really made funding also available for those most marginalized groups who are migrants, refugees, internally displaced population, and their host communities to COVID-19. So I think it's very important to make sure that those populations are also included, because you don't want to exacerbate tension and you don't want to have those groups even further marginalized. Third, we have also trying to bring more incentive for hosting countries who, again, are carrying the biggest burden by hosting most of the refugees worldwide. We have bring more incentive because they're providing a global public good. And therefore, under IDA window for hosting communities and refugees, the fund for the poorest countries that will start on July 1st, we have made available up to $1 billion in grants for COVID-19 response. And that's something which is very important. And there are really two principles that are underpinning this approach. First is that, and I think we heard it from IRC, from UNHCR, I think the complementarity between humanitarian and development assistance. We are not a humanitarian partner, and therefore we are really all the time trying to focus on the national system, strengthening the country systems, taking a medium-term perspective, and really trying to ensure that our response and the government response is sustainable to benefit refugees, but also hosting communities. So that's the first principle, very important. And the last point I would like to mention regarding COVID-19, in addition to all the response that will be provided, is that we need, as an international community, to also realize that the response to COVID-19 should not come to the detriment of other forms of support to refugees and IDPs and host community. And that has been also a message for the International Rescue Committee, which is, I think, very important. In many cases, the pandemic is an emergency on top of other emergency for a population that has gone through many issues. And that's why at the bank, we are scaling up our support for all those countries that are hosting refugees and all those countries that are really impacted by COVID-19. Over to you, Teresa.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Franck. And yeah, I think that's, such an important point that we are talking about a population that already has so many struggles and they're working to overcome, so many obstacles. And COVID-19 is, sort of a very unwelcome, just added layer on top of all of those things, which, is a great challenge to everyone working in the humanitarian and development system right now. We're going to move on to our question and answer. And just for our audience, we are going to run a little bit over our 10 a.m. time, considering we got started a little bit late for technical issues, but we want to ensure that we have proper time to take questions from our audience. So we will be running just a little bit over. So the first question is for Minister Onek. And how do you build public support for your inclusive refugee policies? Do you encounter any public opposition to your open door policy?
Thank you, Teresa. We really don't encounter much because the refugee welcome in Uganda is by the ordinary citizens, the population. And the government is just actualizing what our general population feel, because we went through similar experience during the 1970s when Idi Amin was ruling our country. It was a brutal and murderous regime. Most Ugandans ran to exile and people came back. And then thereafter, again, we had a lot of internal insurgency where people of West Nile, part of the country, northwest of the country also had to flee to exile because Idi Amin came from there. Now, we have resolved as the country that we need peace. We need to accommodate each other. And we also appreciate the agonies which those who are tormented by bad regimes and suffering in their countries are going through. And therefore, we let them stay as our guests. But in doing so, we enable them at the same time so that they have additional skills. By the time they go back to their country, they will be able to help themselves. And meanwhile, our government in Eastern Africa here, our president is working very hard to try to coordinate peace, coexistence amongst his colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in South Sudan, in Rwanda, Burundi. So there are a lot of peace negotiations going on to enable these countries to accommodate their countries, their country's citizens, irrespective of their political views, irrespective of their differences, because we can never be the same in ideas. We have to accept and tolerate opposing ideas. Now, the challenge we are facing as government right now is connectivity, where particularly up country, like in the northern part of the Uganda, where the roads are poor, really it's mud earth road, and the trucks get stuck and so forth. And we are just appealing to our donors, including the World Bank. Mainly the World Bank is already offered to do one road, to come forward and help us to make mobility possible with the refugees, so that when they are trading and moving, it's possible to have that interactions and that investment. Also, the World Food Program, it seems to be running short of donors. And currently, they only supply 70% of the food ration that they should give to the refugees. And now the refugees are scavenging, they're struggling, trying to find the difference. And some of them are not performing well. Some refugees are doing well. So we have those challenges on food as well. So these are the few things that I thought I would mention. But our population are very receptive. They see the suffering of their brothers and sisters from those other countries as they also experience when we had a bad regime in our country. So that's why we are soft, we accept them, we live with them, educate them, and enable them to even do business and develop. And when they go back to their country, we would like to continue with long-term friendship and relationship of that nature for peaceful coexistence in Africa. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minister, for that view. The next question is for JB. What types of refugee policy reforms are needed in Kenya to ensure refugees can be self-reliant and contribute to host communities?
Thank you again, Teresa. Definitely, I've touched a little bit on some of them, but I did mention we desperately need to allow refugees some level of freedom in terms of movement. For what we already have right now is the beginning of an area-based approaches or planning, which really looks at very localized county government support towards refugee and developing policies around that and supporting refugees where they exist, where they live in the camps and where they exist. So we think that this is the starting point, but it also has its limitations because it will depend from one county to one county or one administration to the next. I think that we need to take it to the next level. Freedom of movement is really critical to allow those refugees, because we can't assume that a refugee wants to live in that particular locality. There might not be enough opportunity or jobs. And so I think the freedom of movement is really an area of concern. I think it's also ending the restriction around work permits. So actually right now the refugee law says that refugees are allowed to work, but in reality, what that requires is for them to get work permits. It would be interesting for you to note that to get a work permit for a refugee, they have to go through the exact same process as an expatriate. So you can imagine a simple man or woman who then has to go through the legal process to, like an expatriate. They don't have the resources to do that. It's just not possible. Again, when you go to the different departments of government, there's a lot of confusion and lack of clarity on what the exact policy is, so that it allows the refugee to get the work permit. And so, actually, I don't know any refugee actually who has a work permit, who's ever been given a work permit. The other one I mentioned earlier on was really the issue around financial inclusion. Which is very much tied to telecommunication. Here in Kenya, when you have your phone and you have your SIM card, then your SIM card becomes like a bank, a bank that identifies you and also allows you to keep money. And so many refugees are not able to do this. They have to depend on Kenyan citizens to do this, because it's tied to your identity. And with you, the identity, the alien card, it keeps shifting and changing with time. When the period elapses, your identity changes. So the telephone company cannot allow you then to have that SIM card or access mobile money. So these become some of the immediate restrictions besides the freedom of movement. There is also a whole rhetoric around securitization of refugees. Refugees being seen like they're, a security threat, a security problem. Actually, and I think this is a rhetoric that has been, unfortunately, also encouraged by the government, and therefore people tend to see refugees as people to be afraid of, or people who they're suspicious of. And I think this really, there has to be a shift really around this. There's also the fact that refugees cannot pay taxes, because since they're not working, they're not paying taxes. Some of them actually do run businesses on the side, but because they do this underground. I think one of the reforms that really need to happen is with the Kenya Revenue Authority, to bring the refugees into the tax net, because once they do that, the government benefits from the work that the refugees are doing underground. But at the same time, it means that the refugees can come out and not fear, exposing themselves and not having to depend on local Kenyans, people helping them out. I think these are some of the immediate things that we can think of around. Again, investments being done by the national government and the county government as a clear allocation of resources being given to those counties that host refugees. Right now, there is nothing being given to those counties hosting refugees from the national government, even though they are hosting these refugees. And I think such allocations from the national government would ensure then that the county government becomes accountable for resources, however much or however little, in how they're using the funds to support the refugees as well as the host community. So in the absence of resources, it's just rhetoric right now. It's a lot of talk of, area-based approaches, but when the government is actually not making a clear commitment on that. And I mentioned really around the safety nets, the persons living with disabilities. We have clear policies around supporting people with disabilities, people with the elderly, the very elderly and vulnerable, but they don't apply to the refugees. So I think that those are some of the areas that need some reforms. Thank you.
Excellent, JB. Thank you so much for that. One final question before we wrap up our conversation here is for Ewen. How can leaders focus both policymakers and the public on long-term solutions when the reactive domestic political culture is all about scoring points in a game, at least as reflected in the media? How do you keep robust human rights protections integrated into all development projects and not sidelined as an afterthought?
So thanks for the easy question at the end of the panel. You were keeping that one for last. Look, as I said in my earlier remarks, this is a long-term challenge. UNHCR has been in this business for almost 70 years. And if there were any easy answers, I'm sure we would have found them by now. Now, we are really very encouraged overall by the engagement in recent years of a far stronger and broader range of partners in this space. I think it's no secret that the convergence of fragility, poverty, conflict, violence, and protracted displacement are all in this bundle of global public bads that we have to join forces to combat. And the best way of doing that is through the kind of partnerships and approaches that we've all been discussing over the last hour or so. And nothing breeds success but success. And I think the more that we can show tangible evidence, and particularly bringing greater knowledge, data, and insights about what works and what doesn't work, highlighting the shining example of Uganda and other extremely generous refugee-hosting countries can shine a light on these kind of successes, then the more we will build the kind of support and public engagement with these situations. There are no simple, straightforward answers here. And we believe that this kind of engagement is really the critical way forward. A word, if I may, on the policy review exercise to take place in the coming weeks and months. As Franck very rightly said, this is not trying to set up an index because the review has a kind of evaluative connotation to it. I see it really as, and I think I speak on behalf of UNHCR on this one, we do see it as an important learning opportunity to understand what works, to understand government perspectives, to understand the perspectives of local communities, and not least, what are the perspectives of refugees? And what do they need and how do they see overcoming the vulnerabilities generated by exclusion? What do they need to overcome these? And in particular, to give them the planning perspectives and the predictability in their lives that they need gradually to acquire greater resilience and to be able to slowly develop the human capital, skills, and capabilities that they need. Without these, we think there's no real answer to their exclusion, there's no real answer to their poverty, and there's certainly no real answer to bringing solutions either to these situations as a whole or to the individual challenges that both refugees and poor households globally encounter. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. It's really been a great pleasure to listen and learn from my fellow panelists as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ewen, for those closing thoughts. We are going to wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from around the world, for bearing with our technical difficulties. We hope to see you again at future Fragility Forum virtual sessions. You can check the World Bank website for the full schedule. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you, Teresa.
And bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.